everybody, and welcome to this Turning the Tide webinar. We are recording this session, so if you don't wish to be on camera, please turn your camera off now. This webinar is taking place in the framework of a large-scale Creative Europe funded exploration of the potential role of socially engaged artists in dialogues about climate change in waterfront cities of Europe. It's called Turning the Tide, and the partners involved are Sweden in the lead role, Poland, Greece, Austria, and the Netherlands. And we are in Scotland are honoured that we are still able to play a part in spite of Brexit. It will be practice-based, so we've got case studies of artists practicing in each of the participating cities. And this session is the first of a series of webinars where we're exploring some of the context and the distinctions around socially engaged practice and cultural planning. We are being assisted by academics from University of the West of Scotland, from Robert Gordon University, and Creative Carbon Scotland, who have very kindly allowed us access to all their resources and materials around culture and climate change. This is the first of a series. The next one will be Friday the 26th of January at the same time. And that one is going to be focused on cultural planning. So make sure that's in your diary. I'm Liz Gardiner. I'm your host for this morning. I've been working in socially engaged practice for 4 decades now, making interventions in policy areas in Scotland, starting with disability in the 1980s, which led to the formation of a integrated theatre company called Birds of Paradise, who are very successful today. And then moving into place-based regeneration and all sorts of other policy areas. The shape of the hour today, we've got a contribution from Dr. Tara Beall, who is a socially engaged practitioner of vast experience. She's going to be helping us to tease out and interrogate exactly what is socially engaged practice. There'll then be a dialogue, and we're inviting questions and comments from the floor. Either you can put them in the chat as you're listening, or you can put your hand up. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see an icon where you can raise your hand. So I think it's time to hand over the floor to Dr. Tara Beall. Thank you very much, Tara. Take it away.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're connecting from. I want to just start really by thanking everyone for the invitation. It's an honor, and really interested to see how the conversation goes. What I thought that I would do, what I've been asked to do, is to just maybe tease out and speak a little bit about what socially engaged practice is, also maybe about what socially engaged practice isn't, or in my very opinionated opinion, what socially engaged practice is not. And then I'll probably spend about half the time talking about that. And then skip very quickly to speaking about one specific project which I've been involved with for the last several years and or about a decade, depending on how you slice these things or count these things, which does kind of pivot around an issue of climate change. So that's kind of what my contribution is going to be. And then I really look forward to the conversation and the questions. I'm going to try to say at least 1 or 2 things that are at least slightly provocative. And I'm very much looking forward to everybody's thoughts on them. So I'm going to just share my screen, so please excuse the sort of necessary tiny bit of faffing while that happens. There we go. So hopefully you can see that. Can someone give me a thumbs up, Liz? Or yeah, great stuff. Okay. So in terms of thinking about socially engaged practice, thinking about what it is, what it isn't, I'm going to just show a number of slides which are all text-based, but I promise you there will be images in the second half. um, Thinking about sort of the terminology that's used around socially engaged practice, I think it's just good to start off by saying there's a lot of different types of language, and it is still something that's expanding. I think it's settled a bit in the last 10 years, but it is something that is still kind of expanding. So you'll hear socially engaged practice or social practice quite a lot, or dialogic art. You'll also hear community arts or public art sometimes, or participatory practice. It's kind of a broad Kirk, as folks would say in Scotland, and many practitioners work with or kind of align themselves within these sort of lines. I generally keen towards Pablo Higuera's definition of socially engaged art. That's from 2011, and that is as much as anything because he is his kind of definition focuses on and pivots on a kind of visual arts practice, if that makes sense. So he describes socially engaged art as a form of performance in the expanded field, and I think that's a really useful way to think about that. Another really useful person to think about, I think, is Grant Kester. So Kester sort of highlights, and this is from 2013, so again, about 10 years ago, but he highlights the discursive and connective aspects of this practice. And within his kind of framing or his visioning of these types of works, he says we encounter a willingness to engage in the domains of activism and urbanism as collaborators rather than competitors. So I think the issue of activism within contemporary arts practice enters in really clearly in his visioning of it. And I think that's also really useful and really and often quite common. Artists, according to Kester, who are working in these ways, they exhibit what he calls a reciprocal openness to and a dialogue with participants whose unique knowledge and experience are essential to the work's content and development. I think this can't really be overstated. So basically that issue of how artists are coming in, perhaps working with and alongside, embedded in communities, but they're absolutely focused on the expertise that lives within those communities. And how do we kind of really highlight that? How do we amplify those voices and that incredibly important experience? I'm just going to share a couple of things that in my observations, they're sort of like traits or common threads that socially engaged practice or practitioners often have, like ways that you could maybe recognize socially engaged practice. And that includes this a real lengthy process of listening. So perhaps that's scoping, or perhaps that's kind of a visioning of pattern recognition within a particular place, within a particular sequence of communities, within a particular project, but there's like a real focus on listening. There's also almost always, Kester calls it a dialogic practice or dialogic art, this kind of focus on discussion, just discursivity. Artists will always, or practitioners will always be asking questions which attempt to or somehow move into revisioning or reframing a situation, like thinking about reframing a particular challenge or a particular locality. The really incredible artist from the Netherlands, Jean van Heesek, often starts her projects by asking things like, who cares for this space? Who cares for this park? Who cares for this place? And I think those types of questions are really central to this kind of way of working. Another thing is really obviously the focus on collaboration or participation or co-creation. There's a lot of different terminology that gets floated about, and I'd like to unpack that in a minute just really quickly. But again, just quoting Van Heesek, she says, the artist must decide who they will serve. And I think that's very important as you're walking into a project, or as you're kind of visioning a project. I'm really fortunate that I'm often helping to vision the projects that I'm working with and working with communities with. And I think, but even within that, you have to be really clear about whose agenda comes to the fore. And I said we'll go over this very quickly, but I do feel like there's some value in thinking about kind of mapping out or doing some kind of a Venn diagram of the different types of terminology that get used when you're talking about social practice or socially engaged practice, from consultation, participation, collaboration, co-creation, to whatever it is that you have all the way here on the right of your screen. So maybe you decide that that's placemaking or cultural planning, or those types of things. I won't go into too much more detail here, but there's quite a lot of really excellent writing on some of this stuff. But I just wanted to point out that in my opinion, the opportunity for transformation of a situation, or a revisioning or reframing of a situation, generally happens towards the right side of this screen. So when you're talking about co-creation and or placemaking and or cultural planning, where you have a situation where you have the commissioners and the artists and the participants who are sharing authorship. So the artists are sharing authorship with the participants that they are working with, that you have a kind of a shared authority. You have what Bernadette Lynch writes about this very explicitly within a museum's context, and I think extremely well. She talks about transformational practice, and she speaks very specifically about whose agenda, who is at the table, who has the floor, who is able to speak at the table, and how do we increase kind of transformational opportunities within these types of practices. I'll just speed on, but I did want to just point out the other thing that's, I think, useful to think about in terms of this kind of, like, if we're mapping out these different types of tools. First thing I want to say is that all of these things are really valuable. So, it's entirely useful to have consultative processes, to have surveys or focus groups or comments, even within a creative project. But especially, if you're an organization looking to share what should happen within a particular park, or you want to commission an artist to do something in a particular location, but you're not sure what. Absolutely, these are important tools. I think what is important to be mindful of is what I would call participation inflation, right? Where you're actually doing consultation, or you're working within a kind of a participatory practice where people are invited to be involved, but they are, for example, being invited to plant a tree very specifically. It's a very specific role that they're being asked to be involved in, that you don't then call that co-creation or placemaking, that you're honest about the kind of the connectivity that you have with the participants and with the folks in the communities that you're working with. The other thing I would say about that is, as you get towards the sort of right end of the scale, the amount of time, the amount of resources, the amount of energy, and the potential for failure increase, in my opinion. And your ability to predict or control outcomes also increases, I think, substantially as part of all that. A couple more common methods, and then I promise we'll get to an example. I think a lot of these processes focus on challenging or troubling or trying to kind of soften up dominant narratives, dominant historical narratives, the way in which things have been viewed or framed in the past. These practices, this is, again, in my opinion, are very specific. So what they are not is scalable. They are bespoke. They are for a specific location. They're locally rooted. You'll hear words like, hyperlocal or glocal. They're often kind of behind the scenes or subtle. I think socially engaged practitioners are sometimes actually not very good at promoting all of the things that they're doing. They're more interested in creating platforms and opportunities for the communities that they're working with, to have some kind of amplification, or to take front and center in terms of the projects. And then this is sort of the last one, and I think it's a really important one: the aesthetics of the creative output. So there's the process of the work, the process of the socially engaged practice, the process of the social practice, which is incredibly important. But the aesthetics, or the creative outputs, or what gets made, the art part of this process, the visual aesthetics of those, or the format, or the media, often shift with the context. They shift with the project. They shift with the communities that you're working with. And I would go so far as to say that if an artist is working in a variety of communities, locations, formats, groups, privileged enough to be working in more than one country, then, and if their work always looks the same, then I actually think there's something to be said for asking whether that's actually social practice or actually socially engaged practice rather than a collaborative practice, if you see what I mean. I think that part of what needs to be done, or part of the process of making these types of projects, does absolutely involve, as an artist, kind of relinquishing authority, relinquishing kind of aesthetic, some level of aesthetics, to the process and the community and the place. Okay. So almost done. Just one more word from Kester here. So he says that, within these processes, artists begin their work not with the desire to express or articulate an already formed creative vision, but rather to listen. They define themselves as artists through their ability to catalyze understanding, mediate exchange, and sustain an ongoing process of empathetic identification and critical analysis. And I think that's, yeah, I really agree with that. I think it's incredibly important. So to close out this section, I've hit you with a lot of text, so I hope everyone's doing okay out there. Um, you might be asking yourself, right, so how on earth do we decide, like, or how do I decide? How on earth do I decide if a project is like, what's a good socially engaged creative artwork look like? How do you judge it? What are the metrics? What are the kind of, how do we think about these things? So these are some of the things that I would say. So if everything goes well with a bit of luck, timing, skill, craft, sometimes these artworks can offer some elements of transformation of the situation, offer some kind of a reframing or revisioning of a situation. They can engender, again, luck and timing are important, some kind of continuity or legacy or continued conversation out with the artist's impact or the artist's kind of contract, to be practical. There is the potential for new knowledge production within all of this. I'll come back to that in a second. And I think it's also important to say that if you're making work, if you're making creative work, if your process actually involves a really diverse group of people that you are working with and within to decide what does the artwork look like, what is the output, what is the outcome, that all of the people involved or many of the people involved will be really invested in that outcome. So they will feel that it is there. It is actually shared authority, and their investment in the outcome will be kind of proportional, or there is some kind of relationship between participant investment in what it looks like, how it is, and how much agency they've had in the process. I will leave that there and then just move on to speak about a project that I have been lucky to be involved with for the past few years. How are we all doing? Everyone okay? I can't see that many of you, but yeah, okay, good. Right. So just another couple minutes, about 3, I'd say. So I've been I've had the privilege of working with show people for over a decade now. It started in 2012, 2013 as part of my doctoral research with Glasgow Museums in Glasgow, in Govan, and has just continued on. And during lockdown, I was asked to propose a project in Dumfries looking at Dumfries's riverfront fairs, which have been staged on the banks of the River Nith for at least 500 years, probably closer to 600 or 700 years. And the project that I proposed was called Fair No Fair. I was one of 10 artists who were commissioned during lockdown by the Stove Network in Dumfries as part of Atlas Pandemica. That project, I'm going to just show you some pictures of historic images of the fair while I explain a little bit more about the background of the project, and then I'll show you what we did very quickly as outcomes. So Fair No Fair was a collaboration with traveling show people who have both active and an historic relationship to Dumfries's fairs. And the collaboration kind of pivoted around a series of conversations. We formed a kind of a loose advisory group, which gathered information in the form of stories, in the form of direct images, memories, quotes about the fairground on the banks of the river. And those conversations became the foundation for the creative outcomes that we then produced, the art part of what we produced. The project aimed, and I wanted to share this with you because I want you to specifically pay attention to what I didn't say, which is what the final work was going to look like. This is literally the kind of 4-point bullet point of what I proposed when I proposed this project. The project aimed to highlight the histories of the Dumfries fairs as an integral part of Dumfries and Scotland's histories, to share some of the culture and the current struggles of Scotland's traveling show families, to begin to map stories and memories of the fairground from the perspective of the folks who run the fairs, and to co-produce a final artwork or a small performative events which traces or maps or illustrates the location of the September Rood Fair on the banks of the river. And this then brings us to the issue of climate change, because the fair has historically been flooded many times over, more than over several hundred years, and increasingly the kind of frequency of that is increasing. So the other thing to say is that this project was really scaffolded around the current flood prevention plan by the locality. The flood prevention plan in Dumfries basically will prevent, which has been approved, will prevent the fair from continuing to operate on the banks of the river where it has operated for 500, 600, 700 years. So very quickly, what did we do for this project? I've told you kind of the background, but what on earth did we actually produce? Initially, we hosted a series of walks, kind of heritage walks or walks where I invited a number of show people to come and share different aspects of their own memories, histories, family stories, as relates to the history of the fairgrounds. I wanted to show this to you because it's a very modest, soft start, actually, to a project. So literally just a walk around the banks of the Nith, a bunch of stops, at each stop kind of a thematic focus on thinking about an introduction to the fairs, an introduction to show families, an introduction to the history of innovation, an introduction to thinking about the shows in wartime, etc. All of this then was also kind of pivoted on some historical research, the archival research that I was doing alongside speaking to, many show families who have been operating in Dumfries for a long time. For each of these walks, and they've continued annually. So the initial project stopped in 2021, but these walks have continued. For each of the walks, there's also an opportunity to get some press. We've invited press to do photo calls. And each of those are all different opportunities to kind of drip feed and increase the knowledge base and understanding locally in local papers of the way in which show people are infinitely kind of bound up in the history of Dumfries and the way in which Dumfries thinks about its leisure time. The other thing we did is produce they're sort of museum-esque, heritage-focused signage that talk about the history of Dumfries's fairgrounds specifically. Many of the images that I've shown you and others are printed out on these, and these get put up while the fair is on, also while these walks are on. Some of them also focus on quite specific histories and stories, which I found within the archives, which we don't have time to go into, but I'll just say that, this bridge here in Dumfries that you see kind of at the top left corner of the screen is called on all the maps the Suspension Bridge. But every single show person I spoke to calls that bridge Biddle's Bridge because the Biddles operated right in front of that bridge, and because there is evidence within the archives and within the oral histories and the interviews that I've done that the Biddles would have helped to fund that bridge. So they helped to pay for it. Last thing I'll say is that's just some more images of the walks as we go. In addition to the walks and also the signage, and doing some archival research, we also produced, as I said, I was one of 10 artists. There was produced a series of maps, which were then given into a number of archives, also given to politicians, given to kind of significant influential people within the local council. And the maps that I produced working with show people and working with Fair Scotland, which is an organization that was formed as part of all of this, these are images of the maps, the map that we produced, which you can see it literally riffs off of the core kind of information from the walks themselves, using those family images, archival images to kind of highlight some of the histories that we found and some of the ways in which these communities are really embedded within the history of Dumfries as a town. I will just say in closing a tiny thing about legacy and the kind of ongoing focus of this project and or the relationship of the fairs to Dumfries. I mentioned at the very beginning that there was a flood prevention plan which will make it impossible for the fairs to continue. Just to say, so these are architectural drawings of that plan. You can see this kind of brick fence here, this brick wall will make it impossible for the rides, the fair, to continue to exist in this ground where it has been staged for 500, 600, 700 years. There are plans afoot to commission more artists. So the Stove Network is exploring the opportunity of commissioning more artists to do more work with these histories, to collaborate with show people in the future as a way to continue to keep this issue up to the foreground. Yeah, I will leave it there, and I really look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was a wonderful exploration of the definitions and distinctions around socially engaged practice, and also a fantastic example of socially engaged practice in action. One of the interesting things in terms of turning the tide is the link to the climate change, and also the link to the social justice, climate justice agenda, which you've outlined so clearly. That it very often is the case that the people who are least powerful are the ones who are most affected by climate change, and that's happening worldwide. And what you've just demonstrated is an excellent example of that. I'm looking forward to folks' hands going up and questions into the chat. But for me, I'll kick off the questions with a first thought. George Monbiot in a recent address talked about the need in the world in terms of climate change, the need for a new narrative which overturns the current acceptance, almost resignation, that nothing is possible, nothing can change. The way we've always done things is the way we're always going to be doing things. And what we need is a new narrative of possibility. And I'm wondering if you think that socially engaged practice and this kind of approach can have something to offer in bringing a new narrative, and a narrative of possibility into the frame.
I mean, I would truly be interested to hear what other people in the audience think about that as well. But I think, I mean, I would say cautiously yes would be the very succinct answer. I think it's quite important to always emphasize that artists are not, infrastructural planners. They are not social workers. They are not, there's a lot of things that socially engaged artists are not. And I think it's important to signpost and always kind of say that right at the top. But having said that, I think, as I kind of was hoping, I tried to kind of tease out a little bit. I think creative projects and people working in these ways can be useful in helping to reframe or revision or to build connectivity between disparate groups of humans in a particular location. And I think those elements of connectivity can then be used to build on, to begin to vision forward solutions. Yeah.
Thanks, Tara. And one of the other things that you mentioned in terms of the Fair Glasgow, Fair Scotland, you talked about the formation of an organisation And I'm wondering how important you think that is in terms of legacy of this work.
It's an excellent question, and the short answer is I just don't know. um, I didn't go into much of the backstory just for time, but I know I did say in the talk, so I started working with Show People in 2012, 2013. I should also say that was on it was sort of building on a project that was run and hosted by Fablevision in Govan called the Govan Fairway. And I think it's quite important to acknowledge that like sometimes these projects they really do build on each other in a way that's very valuable. And I think creatives, but also, you know, in general, I think it's very important to acknowledge the folks who've kind of set the ground for you. But anyway, so I began working with Show People 2012, 2013 in Glasgow up until really 2020, and the Dumfries portion of those projects has only really started in 2020. So there's been a long association and a long kind of creative conversation over 10 years, but only the last two has some of those individuals, some of that group we've constituted as a charity. I should also say I'm co-chair with Dr. Mitch Miller of Fair Scotland. And yeah, he's from the shows and also an incredibly accomplished artist and illustrator in his own right. But sorry, to come back to your question, I wouldn't actually be able to say definitively how important the constituting that organization is. I hope it will be very impactful, would be the.
Thanks, Tara. And you know, I'm asking that because in my experience, the artistic intervention, even though it can be longitudinal, even though it can be decades in length, if it's not followed up with embedded organizational practice, it can be ephemeral. I suppose that's where we start moving into cultural planning. There's a question in the chat about sustainable legacy. I think this question is from Intercult. The sustainable legacy of the artistic interventions and projects in the work of the city. What do you think about the methodology? Are artists able to influence policies? When the project is done, will the work still be there?
Yeah, I think this is an
So,
excellent
so there's
question. Sorry.
two parts of that. One is, what do you think about influencing policy? And the other is, when the project's done, will the work still be there?
Right. Well, I'm all for influencing policy as often as someone with strong opinions in many areas, but also as someone who has had the privilege and continues to have the privilege to work with and alongside a lot of different underrepresented communities, or to kind of be able to be helping to recover histories and stories and voices which are really genuinely underknown. So I think that a lot of times those types of stories, and this is definitely true for this one in Dumfries, it's all about trying to, as much as anything, it is really focused at this moment on trying to secure the history of the fairs in the future, because with the current flood prevention plans, they will not be there. So that is definitely a kind of a precise policy impact goal, isn't it? You know, and I please wish us luck. And if you're in Dumfries, please write the council and let them know that you're concerned about the future of the fairground and what are they going to do to make sure that the Dumfries fairs can operate on the sands. So to answer the question more succinctly, I think artists can influence policy. I think that does require, as you were saying, Liz, that does require infrastructure and other organizations to support. Like, it will not function if it's very hard, I should say, for artists and communities, unless there's some organizational support somewhere built in there, to be able to work in these ways and be impactful on policy. And then I think the second half of that question, kind of about legacy, like when the project is done, will the work still be there? I think that keens back to what I was sort of suggesting is, you know, one of the things that I think about in terms of a metric or how you evaluate what is good practice for socially engaged practice. What does great social practice work look like? And I think one of the ways that I personally would gauge that is, has there been any impact? Is there any longevity? Do you have, like, once the artist kind of takes themselves out, or once the project funding ends, do you still have frisson? Do you still have do you still have inspiration? Do you still have connectivity between those groups, disparate groups?
Great. Thanks, Tara. Yeah, and thinking to my own history of starting out with working with people with disabilities who were interested in arts and theatre, it was at that time. Birds of Paradise really changed the dialogue about people with disabilities and what they were able for and what they were able to achieve in Scotland. And there's no, that has continued and grown in momentum, and there's no doubt that both that work remains in terms of its impact, but also the company itself remains continuing to produce work. So although we perhaps don't produce a physical artwork or a sculpture that remains, there's all that other wonderful stuff remaining afterwards. So some other questions in the chat. From Janice Marshall Riley, she's asking, how did this project come about? Who brought Dr. Beall and the other artists into Dumfries? And also, have the show people been offered an alternative local location? I realise that this in itself may not be desirable for many reasons.
So the project, the Atlas Pandemica project, was an initiative of the Stove Network, which is an amazing creative organization, which is based in Dumfries. They proposed this project working with 10 artists. So they commissioned 10 artists. There was an open call for proposals. I applied. 10 artists working with different, like under different thematics, or working with and within different communities. One of them was travel, or so I proposed the working with show people as under that kind of umbrella of thinking about traveling communities, how peripatetic communities. The other artists were they were all artists who were based in D&G. So I live in Dumfries and Galloway, but I also work in Glasgow. I maintain a studio in Glasgow. And to answer your second question, in terms of an alternative location, the answer is not really. So there have been discussions for an alternative location for the fair, but the locations haven't really been firmed up, and also the locations that are being proposed are not suitable. Further, I would say my kind of research, and also the research of others within Fair Scotland, which is we're now a charity, and working to promote the history of Scottish fairgrounds and their future is kind of the sort of strap line. The research by Fair Scotland, which we're conducting now in a slightly more formal way in the next year, suggests that if you move a fair, it does wither. It's not something that you can kind of punt around. It doesn't actually work.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, another question in the chat from Deer Hunter. What methodologies do you apply as an engaged artist to get in touch with minorities and underrepresented sectors, being a white, high-educated academic practitioner?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm a fan of your work, so I'm delighted to see you, even though we've never met. Hi. I think I'll try to be succinct. Yeah, it's quite bespoke. It's quite customized. So I think I tend to work on, like, whenever I can, longer term projects. I'm more interested in durational projects which go on for years and years. I have 2 kind of projects working with specific communities that have gone on for more than 10 years now. I know it sounds bonkers, but it's been a total joy. Working with show people is one of them. The other one is called Protests and Suffragettes, and it's looking at Scottish suffrage histories, the history of women's activism in Scotland. I think the answer to your question is really, for every project, it's quite bespoke. I would tend to work with and connect up with organizations who already have good connectivity with the groups and individuals and communities that I would be interested in working with. I think, first of all, this is more practical, but also it's much more respectful. These organizations who are working, usually third sector in whatever locality, in whatever place, they know a lot. They already know. They know what those communities need broadly. They know broadly the types of concerns. They know what times of day people might want to be meeting. They know what types of ways people might want to be communicating. Like all of these things, I'm quite agnostic with all of those communicatory strategies, right? Because I think you need to be like, I will meet online, I will meet in person, I prefer in person, but I would always privilege and prioritize the way that the communities and individuals I am working with would like to be meeting and talking. So, and the other thing I think that I would say is that I think it's really important to just come up front with whatever your privilege or your biases or you have to be really upfront with that. Where you are, who you are from. I identify as a working class human, but you're absolutely right. I'm privileged to have a high level of education. I'm a cis white woman. That's where we are. So, and also I try to do a lot of listening. That's yeah. Which would be hard to imagine today since I'm doing all the talking, but
Thanks.
thank you
We've
for your
asked you
question.
to. That's what we've asked you to do. A wee plug from Intercult here that we're working since 2010 with the River Cities, a European platform for cultural and social resilience of waterfronts in collaboration with many countries. We will have a call for a new advisory board in a couple of months. Write us a line if you are interested to ivona.price@intercult.se. That's ivona.price@intercult.se if you're interested in joining the board of River Cities, which is an excellent platform. And all the partners in Turning the Tide project are members of that platform. So it really does help to network and keep ourselves in the European community if you're based in Scotland. From Maya, what is your experience in working with the local community? What has their participation been based on? Do you think their interest in the project was rooted in local historical heritage, or was the reason for their willingness to participate determined by something else?
So by local, just to clarify, Maya, by local you mean the communities in Dumfries, yeah?
I'm taking that's what she means. Maya, can you? Yes, she's
Okay,
saying
great.
yes. Yeah.
Thank you. So specifically within that project, I think my working with show people who've been operating in Dumfries kind of pivots on the previous 8 years of my working with show people. So I'm in a really lucky position in the sense that I've been working with these communities who sometimes are not always very open to be working with working with outsiders, with new people, and that is because of the amount of discrimination, racism, kind of horrible media that traveling communities across the UK get. So I think my experience and the participation, like the background participation, is based on a kind of a long-term relationship with these communities who operate shows and fairgrounds across Scotland. The working with the local, as in the settled community in Dumfries, that was something that the Stove also helped to organize. I've been based in Scotland for 20 years, but I've only been in Dumfries for about 6 or 7. So it's quite important to say that I'm actually a little bit new Still a little new in Dumfries. And I hail, you'll have maybe already figured out I'm American. So I'm not Scottish. And so these are all things that come into play, when you're working with communities like, well, who are you and why do we care what you think, American? Those are valuable questions, I think, and it's right for communities to ask them, to be honest. I think their interest in the project, some people are interested in the kind of historical aspects of the project, the history, the local history, and some people have been interested in coming along to walks or talks or all of those things, or as show people participating because they're interested in trying to raise the profile of their own histories, their own families. Many of the show people who operate rides on in Dumfries now can trace themselves back 6 generations. Like they can tell you exactly where their great great grandfather operated on the Nith and what ride. Like, was it a carousel? Was it a kids ride? They'll tell you exactly what it was. It's quite incredible. Thank you for your question.
And just to add to that, I think also, I mean, you talked about working in Govan as well, because there is a show people community on the banks of the River Clyde in Govan who face similar problems of forced eviction from their site. And so it's a problem that is common to traveling show people in Scotland. We are going to be visiting both of those communities when we are in Glasgow for the Turning the Tide Climate Summit, which is happening at the end of April. Everybody's invited to come and join us, and we will be live streaming that from Glasgow's Centre for Contemporary Arts, so you can join in this type of forum as well. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What does everybody think? I'm just wondering because there's a lot of kind of very accomplished artists in this group as well as organizations. So I'm just wondering, what do you think the things that I said about social practice or socially engaged practice? Does anybody disagree with? And I think I said some pretty, not maybe I don't think they're questionable things, but I said some challenging things. I mean, does anybody have strong thoughts about that one way or the other? I'm just curious. Was it useful, that bit? You can be honest, we can take it.
Please join in. Please don't feel you have to be silent. Please, yes, Remy.
Hi, yeah, Remy and Marlisa. Hi, thank you for your.
Oh, sorry, it's Mariah. It's Mariah, not Remy.
Don't worry, it's both. Don't worry. Hi, no, I first of all, thank you for your elaboration on a more theoretical part, which I think is something that we sometimes forget in the practices and in the artistic, socially engaged practices, that there's a theory behind it. So I think it's nice to sometimes being remembered to that. And of course, there's plenty of definitions and words and misused or misplaced words. Some would even say, but I wouldn't say that it's very much about the definitions or the words, but about how they could become productive in a socially engaged practice. And that is where I think where method comes in. How do we do things? How do we go from theory into practice? And that is often where the artist does his or her magic in a way, whereas that is where we would like to see as academics or as practitioners who really enjoy methods, where we would really like to know, how do you do things? And that is something sometimes very challenging to share, and also it asks a vulnerability to share it, and that is something that so what I'm actually saying, that I enjoy the theory and I enjoy also the practice, but how we go from one to the other, that is where I think the most challenging part is always a bit hidden. And so that's it. If you ask somebody to start saying something, then that would be me saying this.
Thanks, Marai. I mean, from a personal perspective, when I started out in the 1980s, there wasn't really any theory at that time. It was just feeling our way, practicing and doing things that we just thought needed done. At that time, there were no distinctions around socially engaged, participatory. What it was just, there was the arts, which was regarded as opera, ballet, proper arts, and then there was everything else, just all lumped in. It was called community arts, and it included all of the types of activities we're talking about. So where we've come from and where we are now is hugely further along the way, that we have got these definitions and we have got a theoretical underpinning now for the practices that we've all been engaged in for so many years. So yes, I think we're in a much better place, but I suppose you're right. The danger is that we then just get sucked into the theory and nobody actually talks about how to. So thanks for that too. We've got another hand up, Vera Thomas.
Unmute. Hi Tara, I suppose a long time ago. Nice to see you again. I think I can relate to, it was a very good talk. I think I can relate to almost every word you said. Luckily, in my during the last years, I've been just involved in a social community practice with artists, and it's too soon now to see how long that will stay and hopefully become a heritage. But 2 years later, it's very much still alive. So I'm happy for that. Well, thank you for a nice show, and Alice, good to see you again.
Thank you. Some more questions in the chat here. One from Saska asking about the interlink between this specific project presented and the climate change perspective, how the practices influenced and contributed to the discourse and policies related to climate change.
Yep, this can be really short. I don't think it has impacted the policies, and that's probably, in a nutshell, I think that's the problem. I think that the policy has been made without considering the impact on the town, the entire town, but also in this aspect of the fairs, the fairgrounds, but also on the communities of show people who come and operate twice a year fairs in Dumfries. Yeah, so I think it's still to be decided. I think what is definitely true is that most people in Dumfries haven't really considered that the fair will have to move, and or will probably wither away, that this plan, this design will end the fairs effectively in Dumfries. I think that is part of the desire to continue working, and to continue kind of trying to raise the profile of these histories and the precarity of the fairs.
Yeah, and another one from Manya, which kind of relates to that, exactly what you've just said, which is, who do you serve is a useful term, but it's tricky when the money or the power to make a change lies somewhere else. And I think that's what you're illustrating with the travelling show people. Another hand up, Phil, welcome.
Hello, sorry, I'm juggling I'm trying to do this on my phone, so it's not working. It's not really a question. There's a comment. There were two things that popped up for me that I thought were really good to hear and could maybe be two more lectures in their own right. I really loved the confidence in which you talked about can and might make change, and that was really refreshing for me. I feel like there is such a danger in our world of of making and kind of false promises, especially when we're trying to appease policymakers and funders. We're constantly saying that we're going to make change, and then I feel sometimes that we are asked to be magic makers. I'm thinking about where artists were kind of used after the pandemic to fix social problems, which we couldn't. We're just human beings. That was just a comment, I guess, that I really liked hearing, the confidence in uncertainty. And then my second thought was when you said about artists and seeing the same outcomes, and I really liked that too. I understand where it comes from. I guess a kind of need for assured quality of work, which might not happen. I think when we make this kind of work, that if we're making it authentically and honestly, there's a risk that the outcome's going to be something else. And I really liked that you challenged that.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Yes, it's been ever thus the expectation of the artist to fix problems. That's been a problem for several decades now. And I think where my thinking has gone is that it must be, our work must be part of a cultural planning approach. We must work cross-sectorally. We must involve politicians and planners and all the people with the power. Because if we don't, then A, we're vulnerable, and B, the work won't have the kind of impact that we would like it to have. I think, what Tara's told us about the Stove Network, and that's one of the case studies that we'll be visiting when you come to Glasgow. The Stove Network is probably the very first artist-led community development trust in Europe, which is doing this kind of work and working cross-sectorally in partnership with local authorities, politicians, everybody who can actually make a difference and make it happen, plus the Scottish Government. And I think maybe that's something, Tara, that we haven't said about your work with the show people. You've also made a group within the Scottish Parliament with politicians there, so that there can be ongoing influence, which is, again, really, really important. So I'm aware we're coming to the end. So any last thoughts, Tara, from you, just to respond to anybody? Or
Apologies. We have another question from Lisa about measuring quality and evaluation, and what parameters are there to take into consideration in my opinion. So I think I did try to cover a little bit of that towards the end. I think there are a few things that I look for within my own work, within my own projects, as ways to kind of start to judge if something is going well. And those are, kind of that idea of has the situation been revisioned or reframed, or is there any kind of element of transformation? Is there any kind of continuation or legacy? Do we feel that has there been kind of new insights or new knowledge production? And also, do the participants, do the people that I am working alongside feel that what we have made together is theirs? Like, so it's not my work that they've just kind of helped impact, or I've used, or it's not that I've used communities. I'll say something else. We've got 1 minute to go, so I'll say something else really provocative. It's not that I've used these communities as source material, right, for my work. we've designed work together, and those individuals or communities feel that it's their work. It's not me using them as a source to make my work. Those are the kind of things that I kind of tend, that keep me up at night.
Thanks, Tara. Right on time. A big thank you to you for a wonderful presentation. Thanks to everybody for their questions and feedback. And thanks to all the partners, to Intercult for hosting, and thanks to everybody. We'll see you at the next one.